Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome to another video. And today I thought I would do the reading shifts tag. So this tag was created by Hannah from Hannah's Books. I will leave her original tag video down below. I'm not sure whether or not I've been tagged in this. I think I have a few of these in my watch later playlist from other people, so I might have been. But I have seen this around quite a bit and it seemed like a fun tag, so I thought I would answer the questions today. I feel like I haven't done a tag video for ages, and sometimes when I do tags I prepare for them and sometimes I don't, and today I haven't really prepared, but I do have the questions in front of me, so I thought I would go through the questions and respond and tell you about my reading changes over time. So question 1 is, how has your reading developed over your lifetime? Do the kinds of books that bring you the most pleasure now differ from the books you loved most earlier in your life? So I read and liked to read as a child, but I first really got into reading as a teenager when I discovered Victorian literature. I read Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte and just loved it, and then just read a ton of Victorian literature. From the age of about 13 to the age of about 18, I basically only read books published in the 19th century. I can think of like 3 books I read that were not from the 19th century, and everything else I read was. And obviously books from the 19th century, and especially from Victorian Britain, still bring me a ton of joy. That is something I read a lot of. I feel like I found my main bookish niche pretty early on in life, and have loved it ever since, and I'm sure I will continue to do so. So I feel like the kinds of books that bring me the most joy, in a way, have kind of stayed the same, but I feel like everything around that has changed quite a lot. As I said, until I was sort of 18, I didn't really read much that wasn't published in the 19th century, and then I went to university and studied lots of 20th century literature, and found some modern authors that I like, and found a bunch of new genres and authors and things to discover. When I was in my early 20s, I liked, or at least thought I liked, literary fiction, but I feel like I quite quickly discovered that actually that wasn't exactly the kind of books that I was looking for, or at least I didn't really want the sort of high literary stuff. I got into historical fiction, into Japanese literature, and then I'd say like over the sort of past 5 years, I've probably sort of expanded even more in terms of what I read. I probably read more sort of crime and rom-coms than I used to, and I also read sort of much more broadly within classic literature, I would say, than I used to. So as I said, I feel like I found like my niche area as a teenager, but I feel like everything around the niche has come a bit later. Question 2 is, do you find yourself choosing different kinds of books at different periods of the year? Do the seasons affect what you read? So I would say that I'm not really very much of a seasonal reader. Like, I'm not someone who only reads a certain kind of book in the winter or summer or whatever. I feel like generally the seasons don't affect me in that way. But I do feel like the booktube calendar and the like literary event calendar does impact my reading quite a lot. You know, I host 2 readathons every year, Jane Austen July and Victober, so I always read Jane Austen in July and now associate Jane Austen with July, and I always read Victorian literature in October. And obviously I read Victorian literature all year round, and indeed sometimes Jane Austen all year round, but I always, you know, read nothing but Victorian literature in October, whereas most other months I might read like 2 Victorian novels a month rather than, you know, 10. And Victober has been running like a decade now, so that probably is sort of a cemented part of my reading calendar. And then the other sort of like literary event that I follow or take part in every year is that I read along with the Walter Scott Prize for historical fiction. The longest is announced in February, was announced very recently, and then the winner is announced in June. So between February and June I probably read more historical fiction than I do for the rest of the year, and I'm often reading like new discovery historical fiction, shall we say, from authors I haven't heard of before, not always from the time periods I usually read about. So that's also like a nice part of my reading year. But again, I feel like that is more about the event than the season. You know, I feel like if next year the Walter Scott Prize were to decide to announce their long list in July, I wouldn't still read a bunch of historical fiction in April, if you see what I mean. Question 3 is, do specific experiences in your life ever shape what you choose to read? So yes, but not necessarily in the way that other people have answered this question, because I mean less sort of like personal experiences and more work experiences. I work in the publishing industry and have done for a decade now. I started off in non-fiction, then moved over to fiction, and definitely what I'm working on and my work has affected what I read, even before I started working in publishing. So after I finished university, I did a master's in creative writing, and that year while I was doing my master's, I put myself on a classics ban and only let myself read contemporary, like 21st century literature, because I had decided that I wanted to work in publishing, and I thought, well, I can't, how can I work in publishing when I just don't read modern books? That's ridiculous. So for a year I only read 21st century literature and Jane Austen, because I had a part-time job at the Jane Austen Centre in Bath, but that's a side point. I went from reading, like 90% classics to reading like 98% contemporary books for that year. And that was very helpful, and I discovered lots of new authors that I like and everything like that. But that sort of like career goal, I guess, quite affected my reading that year. And then, as I said, I worked in non-fiction for a while. I later moved into fiction, and when I was moving into fiction, I was sort of trying to read more about the areas that I worked on. In my career, I would say like the main genres areas of fiction I've worked on are historical fiction, and sort of like general commercial fiction, sometimes called commercial women's fiction. I don't love that term, but I feel like maybe you will know what I mean if I say that, and a bit of crime and thriller as well. So the fact that I've worked in those areas means I have read more in those areas, sometimes at work, sometimes outside of work. Even when you're working in the publishing industry, I work freelance now, but when I was in-house, when I was looking for new jobs, you would apply for a job at a publisher, and then you would like spend a week reading as many books from their backlist as possible to make sure you were on top of their catalogue. So there's definitely been sort of points in my professional life where I have been reading for a particular reason, or where my work has really affected my reading. And that's just in terms of genre. I guess it probably has also affected how I read as well. In fact, I'm going to pause that thought here and move on to the next question, which I feel ties in quite well, which is, have there been any times in your life when circumstances have limited or changed your reading in some way? How did you deal with those circumstances? There have definitely been times in my life where life has affected my reading. I would say that my reading patterns are quite irregular. Some months I read 15 books and some months I read 6 or 7 or fewer. And that often depends on what is going on in life, especially what's happening with work. As I said, I'm freelance now, which is a very sort of like peaks and troughs kind of work, where some months you're very busy and some months you're much less busy, and which I like and suits me well, but that does definitely impact how I read. I would say that I haven't really had times in my life where I have read a lot less, except perhaps when I was at university, when I was only really reading what I studied during term time. As far as I recall, it was quite a long time ago now, my memory is that I read for pleasure during the holidays, but only read kind of what I was studying during term time. I did English literature and history joint honours at university. My creative writing masters was very different. I read a ton that year, because I guess that was very important for my writing. There have definitely been years where I have read a lot more than others. For example, I read a lot in 2020, like many people, because of lockdown, having slightly more time and, less ways to use my free time, but also, like many people, being stressed by everything that was going on. And I think, like many people, I read for escape often. Reading is something that I always find calming, even if the book itself is not a calm book, if you see what I mean. I would also say that when I went freelance, that did initially affect my reading quite a bit, especially because as an editor, I do various different kinds of edits, and some of the edits I do are sort of the big picture stuff, character arcs and plotting and pacing, and those things. And I think for me, at least, when you're reading for fun, it's very easy to turn off that set of skills, because that set of skills requires a lot of like thought. It's not automatic, if you see what I mean. And the same kind of with line edits, and basically the same with all sort of qualitative edits. But I also do copy edits and proofreads, which are where you are looking for errors. And when I first went freelance and was spending a lot of time doing copy edits and proofreads, I did find it really hard to turn that bit of my brain off. And I'd find it really hard when I pick up a book at the end of the day after doing a day of copy editing, and I would just like spot all the incorrect punctuation and spot all the inconsistencies, and it would really annoy me. But I feel like I got used to that pretty quickly, and I now have managed to switch off that part of my brain as well, so that I rarely have that problem now. But definitely when I first went freelance, like 3.5 years ago now, I guess, I did read less and enjoy reading slightly less, because I found it really hard to like get out of copy editing mode in my mind. One thing that I did find really helpful, actually, when I was struggling to read physically without spotting errors when I first went freelance, was listening to audiobooks, because an audiobook like, well, one, you can't see what's wrong with the punctuation, but also it just feels more like a finished product because I'm used to working on text. So when I'm reading a book, it's just text. Whereas when you're listening to an audiobook, it's in a different form to the form I work in. So that really helped. And in fact, I haven't spoken about form very much so far in this video, so maybe I'll just add that in here. I read a lot more on audiobook than I used to. I did used to listen to audiobooks as a teenager, but only ever for rereads. Basically, I just had some Dickens audiobooks and I would just listen to them on repeat. But I listened to audiobooks very slowly, probably like an hour a week while exercising. I used to run a bit as a teenager, and that was basically my only audiobook time. I used to get through them very slowly. Wasn't really into them at all. And then over the last sort of 10 years, I have slowly got more and more into audiobooks, and it's slowly become a bigger and bigger part of my reading. Until now, I would say about a third of my reading is done on audiobook. I love listening to audiobooks, and I listen to them a lot, always while doing other things. I can't just really sit down and listen to an audiobook. I find I get restless. But I listen to audiobooks while exercising, while cooking, while doing housework. Even if I'm just like folding laundry, I will put on a chapter of an audiobook. If I'm walking, if I'm doing a puzzle or, tidying up or anything like that. My husband Nick and I also listen to audiobooks together sometimes, which is really nice, especially when we're like on holiday or traveling. If we have a long journey, we will listen to audiobooks together. I also injured my knee. I just worked out it was 6.5 years ago, which makes me feel very old. But I injured my knee a while back and it still isn't completely right. So I spend a lot of time doing physio exercises and have done for the last, I guess, 6.5 years. Well, not quite, because it took me a while to get proper exercises anyway, but I now spend a lot more time exercising than I did when I was younger, and that time is all audiobook time, which is lovely and makes exercising much more fun. So there you go. Okay, I had a really long answer to that question, so on to the next question, which is, BookTube is full of discussion of reading slumps. Have you ever experienced a slump? How did you handle it? And do you have any advice for people who are experiencing slumps? So I thought for a really long time that I didn't get reading slumps, but I think I do get reading slumps. But I don't stop reading during my reading slumps. I just continue reading through them and enjoy the book slightly less, which I don't think is necessarily the right way to go. But they do always vanish. Like, the reading slumps don't last very long. But there have definitely been books I've read and weeks when I've been reading where I read a little bit less, and the book I'm reading, I'm not like fully engrossed in it and I'm not enjoying it as much. Even for example, I sub-vocalize when I read, so I read the words aloud in my head, as it were, like as part of my internal monologue, I suppose, if you see what I mean. And whenever I read, I am sub-vocalizing and reading the words aloud in my head. But sometimes I'm reading a book and I suddenly realize that I have like sub-vocalized the page and read all the words in my head, but I haven't like processed any of them. Almost like I'd left the audiobook playing in my brain, but I wasn't really listening. And I think that is more likely to happen if I'm in a bit of a reading slump and then I'm not focusing as much on the book. So I do have them sometimes, and I can think of a few books that either were the cause of a slump or the victim of a slump, as it were. But I feel like usually, rather than just sort of not reading, I just continue reading and enjoy that book slightly less, which, as I said, is maybe not the way to go, but I think that is how I usually deal with a reading slump. I would say that probably reading in a different format is quite a good way to deal with a reading slump. As I said, I listen to a lot of audiobooks and I feel like I never have an audiobook slump. So audiobooks for me would be quite a good way of dealing with a reading slump. And I guess maybe like rereading an old favourite would be quite a useful way too, potentially. Or like going back to a genre you always love. Or an author whose writing style you always love, something like that. The next question is, booktubers also talk about book hangovers. When they're so moved by a book, they find it difficult to move on. Have you ever felt this way? Not often. I would say that sometimes when I'm reading a short story collection, I have a short story hangover. Especially if I'm reading an anthology, where if one story is really, really good, I kind of don't process the next story properly because I'm still thinking about the previous story. I have experienced that a few times, and that's kind of made me try to read short story collections slower, because I do think sometimes the story immediately after a really good story in a short story collection ends up being unmemorable for me because I'm actually just thinking about the previous story. But I feel like I very rarely find that with whole books. Maybe that's because I read multiple books at a time. Well, I'm always listening to one book on audiobook and reading another book physically, and I'm often reading two books physically at the same time. I would say it is quite common for me to have a classic and a contemporary on the go at once, or, a physical book and a book on my phone that I read if I don't have quite enough time to get my book out, but do have enough time to look at my phone. I have tried very hard over the last like 2 years to replace any doom scrolling with reading a book on the book app on my phone. So I usually have multiple books on the go, which I guess means I'm less likely to like have a book hangover because there's another book I want to get back to. If I am reading a book on the train and I finish that book on the train, I will have probably bought another book with me as a backup, but I will just immediately start reading that because, you know, there's so many books I want to read. Question 7 is, tell us about a few books that almost always work for you. And I can think of a few. Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen is probably the book I've read the most. I love Pride and Prejudice a lot, and I have read it probably like 15 times, maybe more. And I mostly listen to the audiobook of it now. I must have read it physically somewhere between 5 and 10 times, but I must have listened to the Rosamund Pike audiobook well over 10 times, probably like 15 times. I listen to it a lot. And because I know Pride and Prejudice so well, and it's not that long, I also listen to Pride and Prejudice whenever I want like comforting background noise. You know, if I'm on a long journey or if I'm unwell, if I have a migraine, I put on the audiobook of Pride and Prejudice, and if I fall asleep, that's fine because I'll wake up however many chapters later and I'll know where I am because it's Pride and Prejudice. You know, I think like some people when they're ill, they like put on their favourite TV programme or their favourite film, but I put on the audiobook of Pride and Prejudice and it is very comforting indeed. And I think especially because for me, the most likely reason I am to be unwell is because I have a migraine, so it's very nice to have a comforting thing that you do not need to look at a screen for, and the Pride and Prejudice audiobook is great for that. There are many other sort of all-time favourites, I suppose, books I've read many times. Lots of Dickens books, most things by Dickens, Our Mutual Friend especially, but also Bleak House, Dombey and Son, Little Dorrit, Great Expectations, Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte, and Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte are also books I've read a lot, especially Wuthering Heights. I've reread that a lot of times. It always works for me. I really enjoy it, and I always like spot new things. That's another one where I've listened to the audiobook several times. There's also a wonderful audiobook of Wives and Daughters by Elizabeth Gaskell. I can't remember who narrates it, but I'll put it up on the screen. And that's another real like comfort audiobook for me. The books that always work for me do tend to be those sort of 19th century British classics that I first read as a teenager and sort of still love the best part of 2 decades later, because those books are books that I've loved for a really, really long time and that I know really well. And there's something lovely about a book that you know well that you're just kind of returning to. Oh, but also Agatha Christie, who is a newer discovery for me. I think I read one book by Agatha Christie as a teenager, but it's only really been over the last sort of like 5 years that I've really got into Agatha Christie, and then Nick and I have been listening to the Poirot series together. But I feel like Agatha Christie is an author who nearly always works for me, and who also, like, even when I'm slightly annoyed with the endings, because there are a few of them that I don't love the endings, but I love the writing so much that it's always an enjoyable experience. Okay, I think that is pretty much the end of the tag. The final prompt is to tag people. I will tag some people down in the description. I have not thought of who to tag, but I will do so. And I'm also not sure who has been tagged already, because I feel like I am a month or two late to this tag. I don't know. I've lost all track of booktube time because, as ever, my watch later playlist is full of videos and I'm often watching videos from like 2 months ago. I'm currently working my way through many best books of 2025, but I'm pretty sure there's like 1 or 2 best books of 2024 still in my watch later playlist from a year ago. So, you know, it's all good. You know, it's just the same as with books. I love reading books and I love watching booktube videos, but there's just so many that I want to experience. You let me know down in the comments if you have any reading shifts or reading changes to share. I would be really interested to know, and otherwise I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.